I'm absolutely delighted to be here today. What an amazing venue. I'm really excited to spend the next 2 days with you all. I'm going to talk to you today about the work of the Mobilise consortium. I was asked to describe the journey and the journey to drive adoption of real-world digital mobility outcome measures in research and care. And I hope that our journey will actually pass on information into the DARE journey. Now, I hope that will be interesting, informative and useful as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk to you about this journey using this roadmap, which will take us from the formation of the consortium, which is the Mobilise sign here, all the way to what would be hopefully the ultimate goal of driving really adoption of mobility assessment as an enduring standard in research and care. And these are some core pieces of work that I'm going to talk about that have been involved in the in the overall work of the Mobilise consortium that will help inform how we get there. So you'll see this roadmap coming up time and time again. However, this is not a smooth journey. I don't think that any of you will be surprised to hear that. We have really had quite a turbulent time over the last few years. We actually kicked off the project in 2019. So there have been many challenges along the way, many iterations going backwards and forwards. We've had a very difficult changing landscape, not only from COVID, but from also other developments. So we've really had to adapt our work along the way. You won't be surprised to hear that. But what I want to do is to actually go back to the beginning, to before Mobilise was formed, to set the scene. And this has actually been done beautifully by Beatrix and also by Lorenzo, really talking about why these big scale initiatives are needed. This big scale initiative is very focused on mobility. So we have a narrower set of ambitions to deliver on. Nevertheless, they are extremely challenging. So here you can see a definition of mobility that we use in Mobilise. It's a very functionally based definition of mobility. But the global priority that we need to address is that many people do not enjoy that level of mobility. In the EU, a third of people over the age of 75 years have significant limiting impairments in their ability to walk. And that is just the tip of the iceberg, as we've heard. We've got an ageing population which will increase this level of mobility impairment. And also we have people living with significant chronic ill health. So the level of mobility impairment in those populations is much higher than a third. Of course, this leads to a huge impact for the individual, for their quality of life and their family's quality of life. It leads to impacts for healthcare systems, the pressure that is put on healthcare systems, and also at a societal level because we lose productive people into society. And that's why mobility loss is a global priority as identified by the World Health Organization, and it's one that we need to tackle in order to advance therapeutic development, but we need the tools to detect and monitor mobility loss to be able to do this. So that mobility loss is a global priority and we need to be able to measure it. Discrete mobility outcomes really also tell us something very, very important about health. They are termed the sixth vital sign of health. So measures such as walking speed, how active someone is, different aspects of variability of gait really can tell us, give us insights to detect, monitor and predict adverse events. And that's another reason why we need to be able to measure mobility, because that will provide us with the outcomes to manage health and inform research. So at the time that Mobilise was formed, this is a general framework for mobility assessment. And I can say it really hasn't shifted much today, but hopefully we will be making those significant changes very soon. So mobility is largely assessed by asking someone what they think they can do, or observing what they can do, or measuring in a limited way what people can do. And there are a raft of different measures that can be used that are either disease specific, or there are some global mobility measures such as measuring how fast someone walks over a given distance. But when we think about our definition of mobility, it's questionable whether any of those measures are really actually telling us something informative about someone's mobility at a level that they truly care about. Moreover, we have recognised limitations in many of those measures. You all know this. I think one of the key ones is that there's no standard. There's no, it's all fragmented. And when you actually have to come and think about what measure you select if you're running a clinical trial, it's very, very difficult to know which is the best measure to use. And of course, the way these are delivered means that they lack the precision and reliability for the task. There are also some other key limitations, and these have become more and more important, and I know that you're going to hear quite a lot about some of these limitations and have to address them in your own problem solving. That is that the measures that we have are not patient-centric. They don't measure the things that people care about. They are not inclusive. That means that people do not necessarily have access to take part in research, and that should be everybody's right. And people may not necessarily have access to the same standard of healthcare, because many of the tools require people to visit a centre. And if you are immobile or struggling or older or live far away from that site, then that is going to be incredibly challenging. And last but not least, they're not used. This is work from Simon Jaeger in the Mobilise consortium. We're not measuring mobility in clinical studies, in drug development studies, when we're looking at marketing authorization of these therapies, or they're used inconsistently, and there is no evidence of the use of digital mobility endpoints. So this was the status, and sort of still is the status at the moment, but it's changing. At the same time, the pharmaceutical industry were interested to see how they could leverage the opportunity of digital technology together with the growing need to address mobility problems that were frequent across many populations. And they wanted to bring these two opportunities together to develop novel digital endpoints that they could use in trials for drug development in order to really transform and innovate in that space. So collectively, given the health challenge and the pressing need from the pharmaceutical industry, both partners came together to address this unmet need. Can we measure mobility? Can we do it in a meaningful way? And can we do it in a way that can be used across multiple disciplines? So a call was released in 2017 to do just that. And I'm looking at Claudia Matzer in the audience, because Claudia Matzer sent me an email to say, Lynn, there's this call coming out. And I'll talk to you a little bit in a moment about developing a consortium, but that put us into a tailspin, and we learnt very quickly how to use Zoom in the most sophisticated manners well before it became de rigueur, as we now know. So the Mobilise consortium was formed, and it was formed to address, so this was actually formed at the end of 2017 before we were funded, to address this call to action, to develop the next generation digital tools for mobility in research and health. We can think of this as really having the precision of a lab, our gate lab, in a chip. This is what we were really trying to do to really move the field forward. And this is the overall objective of the Mobilise consortium. I'm not going to read it out, but you can see we need validity, we need real-world solutions, we've got multiple conditions, we're going to measure mobility with digital outcomes, and we want to aim for widespread adoption. So this was a very lofty objective for us to take forward. And this is the objective that the Mobilise consortium was formed to deliver. So I can tell you that Claudia and I wrote a list of who we considered the best people to come together to address this objective. And we basically got on the phone and got on Zoom and called every single one of those people, and thankfully they all agreed to form the Mobilise consortium. So by December 2017, we had our consortium together, who'd come together with a range of partners, and we have 34 partners in total in Mobilise, with a very large budget of nearly 50 million, or clearly not as large as the budget in the DARE or the DARE consortium, and 5 years to deliver on this objective. Now, you've heard it before. This is what that objective is what could be termed a wicked problem, and wicked problems are ones that do not have a clear solution because of their very complex nature. And that means that you need highly skilled, highly multidisciplinary teams to come together to meet the challenges, which were many and significant. It sounds like such a simple objective, but the amount of work that has gone in behind that is impossible for me to describe in this presentation. I could be here for a week and probably not even scratch the surface of the amount of work that's gone on. And many of you in the audience I know are from the Mobilise consortium, so you're going to be listening to me repeat myself. Apologies for that. But we have our wide, diverse, multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder approach. As the saying goes, it takes a village, and it takes a village to address this particular objective. What I will say is the funding that was provided by the IMI initiative really gave us the scale and the scope required and to build the team required to deliver on this challenge, and that's often what's missing in research. We carry out pieces of research that would have addressed individual aspects of that roadmap in individual conditions, and what this needed was a whole-scale solution, a whole-scale approach to really deliver the transformational change that was necessary. Here is the team of fantastic leaders. I cannot possibly mention everybody in the consortium. We've probably had more than 300 people working in Mobilise-D, and that number is only increasing. But these are the leadership team that are working across our 7 work packages: management, technical validation, data, clinical validation, regulatory work, stats and dissemination. And you are going to hear talks from many of those individuals that are leading different aspects of this work. So I'm only going to give a helicopter view of the work that's been delivered, and you're going to hear about the challenges and the solutions in more detail from many of the key people within the Mobilise consortium. I should say that I'm the coordinator of Mobilise, and I co-lead it with Dan Rooks from Novartis University. It used to be Ronan Rubinoff, but Ronan sensibly retired from this role, I would say. One of the things that we really had to reverse engineer very quickly was how we involved patients and the public. We'd always planned to involve them from the beginning, but we really hadn't, I think, thought this through quite at the depth that we needed to. So on this slide, I want to acknowledge our patient and public advisory group, who are utterly amazing. They are involved in all of the committees that you can see here in green. I also want to acknowledge Alison Keogh, who you're going to hear from. I think she's either arriving late, she's possibly arriving later today, who's pulled all of this work together. And our patient and public advisors advise within those committees on all aspects of Mobilise, but have contributed in the following way. They've contributed qualitative research, they help us with dissemination and communication, including co-presenting on the platform and writing papers. They have contributed to our knowledge around usability and acceptability and continue to do so, and they've been significant in informing study design, and we have changed the work of Mobilise on the basis of the feedback that we've had from patients, and this is fundamentally important to any work on this scale. So, okay, what did we set out to do? And then I'm going to give you a very brief view of what we found out. So the task was to deliver the tools to continuously assess real-world mobility in multiple conditions. And these are the multiple conditions that we have worked and continue to work with in Mobilise-D. And that's in order to transform health through these real-world digital mobility assessments. The approach was to take a single device approach worn on the trunk, although we're now doing work on wrist-worn devices as well, to develop an algorithm or a piece of software that would run in a device-agnostic manner on any device that had the right technical standards, and this is critically important. That means that you can really expand the level of technical development in the field and make this a much more stable place to work. And by doing so, hopefully generate generic approaches to mobility assessment, because if we think about it, mobility is mobility, like fatigue is fatigue, or blood pressure is blood pressure. You don't need 25 million different ways to do so and have that change in every single patient population. And by doing so, taking this approach, we hope to bring our evidence to qualify a new method by regulatory authorities so that it would be adopted in a widespread manner. Sounds really simple. The overall plan really centred around two large clinical studies, a technical validation study and a clinical validation study. And essentially these were set up to take the data from a device and convert that using a piece of software that was being developed and validated to deliver digital mobility outcome measures such as real-world walking speed, number of steps, step length, that sort of thing. And we term these measures of mobility performance. And then so we had to show we could measure it, and then we have to, and are continuing to show that those measures mean something important to patients, but also they tell us something important about health. And as I've just said, patients are involved in all aspects of that process to make sure that whatever we develop is fit for purpose. And the regulatory authorities such as the European Medicines Agency and the FDA have also been involved in conversations and with regular interactions to also make sure that what we are doing is fit for purpose, so that when we take our evidence to them, they don't say, "Oh, sorry, we don't agree with your method." They say they've already endorsed it on the way through. So I'm going to deal with some of these domains now. They don't stand in isolation. They are core components of an overall landscape that is required in order to move mobility assessment to an enduring standard. So the first one, how do we know that mobility is an important aspect of health? Well, it's sort of obvious really to us all that mobility is an important aspect of health, but we actually have to develop the evidence to demonstrate this, because the regulatory authorities expect to see that we are measuring something that matters, and we're not just thinking it matters because we think it's important. We need to demonstrate it matters to patients. So a really fabulous piece of work was carried out, led by Judith Garcia, and you're going to hear from Laura Delgado Ortiz, I think tomorrow or Wednesday, that looked to explore the importance of mobility and the lived experience of living with walking impairments in a diverse group of patients. And you can see the patients here. These are really relevant to the Mobilise consortium. And what they did was they systematically reviewed qualitative data where people described their experience of living with walking impairments. I think there were over 80 studies that were involved. And they pulled the information together in what they called a meta-ethnography, which was a new method to me, in order to develop the mobility framework that you can see here. And this really summarizes the entire lived experience of mobility. And what they found was that irrespective of your condition, changes in walking profoundly affect everyday life. It doesn't matter what your condition is. That suggests that we should have a harmonized approach to mobility assessment. These changes impact people not just at a physical level, that's obvious, but they also have significant societal, mental and emotional impacts. So this is a global effect in terms of lived experience. And those impacts also then impact somebody's ability to engage with the wider environment, their activity, and importantly, their sense of self, their identity. So this really sets the scene for allowing us to say we are measuring an important aspect of health. There is some other important work that we are engaged in doing at the moment. So if we think about demonstrating that we measure what matters to patients, this is what we need to be able to measure, because changing this is what matters to this lady with Parkinson's disease. And you can see in the quote here, this is from a GP, but also who has Parkinson's disease, describes what patients want to see from their outcomes, patient-centric and relevant. What we are engaged in doing at the moment is making sure that the discrete measures that we have validated link to something that a patient would say, yes, I recognize that and I see it as important. And this is the first fundamental step in gaining regulatory approval. And in doing so, let's visit our framework for mobility assessment today. How does this fit in and what does this contribute? Well, it adds another layer of mobility assessment, and that is mobility performance. Excuse me, what someone does do in the real world. by measuring people's activity and their mobility over a long period of time with a device to produce our digital mobility outcome measures. And arguably, we might think that this gives us a different, more valid picture of the ability to walk in the real world, and we are now testing that these outcomes are meaningful, but they also give us the measure of mobility disability, so that when we are evaluating people, we can say we have changed levels ultimately of mobility disability. Okay. Oh. So it wasn't the next challenge, but another gigantic challenge was, can we measure it? Can we measure mobility in the real world? This is a major challenge. Everybody assumed, by the way, that we could, because, of course, everyone's wearing a device, and you all have devices in your mobile phones, and there are very many commercial devices available. This is work from Claudia Matz's group. But the reality is, when evaluated, none of those devices were suitable for use in patients. They've been developed for use in young adults. They had too much level of error, and that meant that they didn't have the accuracy for use in clinical care and research. There were also issues with consistency around what outcome, what protocol, were they acceptable, and therefore that meant that these measures weren't scalable, and we've just heard from Lorenzo about scalability. So we needed to address that technology gap, and we set out, and Claudia led this work to establish technical validation. And that is to be able to demonstrate the minimum metrological requirements for a device to be suitable to assess a DMO, i.e. what standards are needed. The device had to record for 7 days, so it reduced patient burden. It had to be accurate and reliable in all of our cohorts of interest. It had to address the algorithm had to address sources of confounding and noise. It had to be acceptable to users, and it had to be device agnostic. And the technical validation was carried out by establishing validity of the device, separate from validity of the algorithms, and establishing user acceptability, again, as a separate element. But collectively, all of that work would yield technically valid DMOs. The validity was tested in a technical validation study. I can say this study was due to start on the 1st of April 2020. So you can imagine the levels of stress at the time. That was an incredibly challenging environment to be working in. The study took place across 5 clinical sites in Europe, and we collected data. We aimed for 20 in each of the cohorts here. But essentially, and you're going to hear about this from Andrea in more detail, patients were characterized. We then compared DMOs with gold standards in the lab under standard and functionally related testing. We collected data over 7 days and looked at the effect of confounding features and took user feedback. And we had a gold standard that was an app that was running on the phone. And then we had to, or Andrea, I should say, had to develop a silver standard, I call it the gold standard, where we could compare our DMOs in the real world under unscripted activity. This had never been done before, to establish that they truly were accurate, reliable, and valid. So 3 years of work, probably 15 million euros, I can summarize in a slide. Can we accurately measure real-world mobility? Yes. We can do it in a way that's reliable, accurate, acceptable, and device agnostic. And that is an amazing achievement. And these are examples of what we can measure in a valid manner in all of our cohorts of interest. These measures will increase as we have more time devoted to this area. So moving on, we need to establish now that those measures have clinical validity. That is, they will tell us something important about our clinical cohorts. And this is the work that's ongoing to do this. So first of all, what was the gap? This is a lovely scoping review that was carried out by Ashley Pohemus that looked at the existing level of evidence for clinical validity of digital mobility outcomes at the time. And what they found, I can't remember how many studies were included, but there was a lot, was that there was consistent evidence of validity and responsiveness in all of our cohorts of interest in a range of different digital mobility outcome measures. This underlined that a common approach to mobility assessment is indeed feasible. This was one of our targets. However, there was a significant gap in the validity of these outcomes when data was collected continuously in the real world. So the clinical validation study is addressing this challenge. We aim to enroll 2,400 participants, 600 per cohort, across 16 sites in 10 countries in Europe. This study started on the 1st of April 2021. So again, you can imagine the landscape in which we've been working has been incredibly challenging. Participants have a 7-day digital mobility assessment, detailed clinical characterization, and they also have detailed mobility characterization. And we aim to make sure that our results are generalizable geographically in terms of inclusivity. We're collecting information about the characteristics of participants and degree of disability. And I can say that we've enrolled 2,380 participants into the study, and that is a massive achievement, almost a miracle when I know what the clinical teams were dealing with. So in order to demonstrate the level of evidence, we now need to show that for each valid DMO selected in each cohort, we want to identify the best digital outcome that has construct validity. In other words, it measures what it should measure, and it discriminates known groups. It doesn't correlate with things it shouldn't correlate with. It has predictive capacity, so it can predict clinically relevant endpoints such as falls, hospitalization, exacerbation. We're also interested in predicting changes in the disease status itself. And also, these measures should be able to detect change over time, and that change should also be of a clinically relevant or a minimally important difference. What we're not doing is looking at responsiveness in future interventional trials, and that is a major gap, and I'm going to come back to that in a bit. This sounds really wonderfully easy. I don't know whether you can see this at the bottom of the slide, but in order to be able to carry out the statistical analysis plan, a massive amount of work has been done in the background to address reliability, wear time, weather, number of days needed, data aggregation. How on earth do you take 7 days of continuous data and transform it into the one single outcome that is needed, and data management. So next I want to talk a little bit about implementation, and you're going to hear about this from Giorgio, I think, later today. This arguably is really challenging. I think it is and will remain a challenge for a while. So for implementation, I'm talking about how we eventually get these tools used, and what you need to do is to really seek approval from regulators, because by doing that, people will be confident to adopt the measures and use them in clinical trials and in healthcare if we think about health technology assessment. So what we're trying to do is to develop a new method, a new digital trial method, a real-world digital study method that the pharmaceutical industry can use, and they want to be able to use those measures in order to help them seek approval for new drugs. This is drug development. So that means working with the European Medicines Agency and latterly the FDA. I could give you my own opinions about that, but they may not be so polite to air in this environment. It's been a very, very interesting process, one that I knew nothing about going into, but I've had a vertical learning curve. So regulatory interactions to date are set out here. Now that looks nice and easy. It looks like we picked up the phone, had the odd phone call. You know, here we go. We've got some nice results and findings. Every single one of those interactions involved significant amount of work by a massive amount of people within the consortium. And I am fairly confident to say that all of the academic partners involved never anticipated the level of work that this has generated, but we've learned an awful lot along the way, and we all know why this is important. So I'm not going to try to steal your thunder too much, Giorgio, but the summary advice from the EMA to date, which arguably is the most relevant information that we've been given, is they generally support the general objective of Mobilise. They support in full the technical validation plan. They approve the clinical validation plan. They question the meaningfulness for patients of what we called mobility performance. This comes back again to qualitative work, and more qualitative work. They also highlighted that the ability to detect change has to be, we have to have responsiveness data from clinical trials. So this does remain a major gap in our work. However, this is an enormous achievement to be at this stage and have this level of endorsement thus far, and it puts us on a really strong footing for the future. So, have we really moved the dial to make a significant change to drive sustainable mobility assessment? Where are we at in achieving mobility as an enduring standard in research and care? Well, clearly that is a highly lofty ambition. But this is what we are doing now. So we have our results, and we are going to be passing those results forward, and I hope that we will be passing them to the DARE consortium, and I hope that this tiny piece of work in reality to what is going to be happening in that consortium will help also inform more widely. We want to share our data, algorithms and technical standards. That means that they will be used and adopted by the tech industry, and we need that. We are going to develop manuals and are in the process of developing manuals for implementation in clinical trials and clinical application, and we are going to be sharing those widely. We will be able to advise on the best digital mobility outcomes to use in a wide variety of cases. And as I've just said, we are seeking regulatory endorsement in order to drive this wide adoption. So there's an awful lot of work now that is going on into really pulling what we've learned as well as completing our work in order to hand over a lot of this information to continue to drive change, sustainable change. But I can't leave this talk without really identifying unexpected challenges, and they have been many and they have been significant. COVID is the obvious challenge, of course, but that wasn't the only one. We've got changing regulatory landscape, the importance of the patient voice, the need to demonstrate that has been changing as we've been interacting with regulators. So that's not a level playing field. The goalposts are continually moving around. The regulators have different requirements, and you're trying to balance a conversation with EMA, with a conversation with the FDA, and ultimately come up with a package of evidence that will address both needs. Patient involvement really links to the changing regulatory landscape. We did some significant reverse engineering to make sure that we had patients involved in a meaningful way. That is not sitting on committees, is actually co-designing and working alongside us. That has been, I think, a significant achievement in Mobilise-D and will really drive our sustainability. We heard a little bit about data sharing and standards. I haven't even mentioned the work about data management. I couldn't even scratch the surface there, but that is a significant and remains a significant challenge. One of the unanticipated effects of COVID was device availability, because suddenly you couldn't get the chips that ran in the devices. We had a problem with our original device that we wanted to use. At the very beginning of our clinical validation study, literally as the study started, we had to find the devices, a whole different set of devices, and that was very, very challenging indeed. I could go on and write a book about this. And I want to leave you with these thoughts. What are our remaining challenges, and where are we at in achieving this ultimate goal? Well, I think we've really moved the dial on this area. The patient voice, measurement, accurate measurement, and really developing the tools to understand the meaningfulness. And I think by the end of Mobilise-D, we can say that we've made a significant impact in this area, hand on heart, be able to do that. In terms of implementation, I've got this in amber because I think we've gone a significant way along the road from implementation, but there is more work to be done because we need the clinical trials data. And also I know that there's work going on with software as a medical device. I haven't mentioned that, but I'm sure you will, Giorgio. But to get to this is a huge ambition, and much more work is really needed, and that's where sharing our learning with other consortia, passing that forward, will really ultimately drive this change. But I'm really optimistic compared to 5 years or 6 years ago. I am really optimistic that this is going to happen, and I think it's going to happen in the very near future. So that is an exciting place to be indeed, because what I would like is to have an ecosystem that looks like this. It's a very complex slide, but where we're really using digitisation of care and research to inform all aspects, for patients to have access to take part in research, to have personalised informed care in a timely manner when and where they need it. And this is what we should be aiming for. And that's it.